Hello, my name is Shafek, and I am presenting today a poster with the title A Feminist Recipe for Trauma Representation. As the title indicates, this is a project about trauma. And while human suffering has existed since the beginning of time, trauma as a term is actually relatively new. Trauma theory emerged in the 1990s in what Steph Krabs calls the humanities' ethical turn. By examining the history of trauma studies in the humanities, it becomes apparent that the theoretical attention to trauma memory was fostered by Holocaust studies. And although most of the work produced by key trauma studies figures focuses on Holocaust trauma, the authors presume a universal trauma experience. This notion has been challenged by feminist psychotherapists like Laura Brown, who points out that the clinical definition of PTSD does not really help in cases of sexual assault against women, because while PTSD is essentially about one event that happens as outside of the canon of the everyday for most of humans, for women, when it comes to sexual assault, is something that is very prevalent, that we cannot really define it as something that happens outside of the human experience. 1 in every 4 women in the United States experience some kind of sexual assault in her life, unfortunately. It is important to note here that I have been talking about women in North America. For women who look like me, both trauma theory and psychoanalysis are Eurocentric discourses. In his work on trauma of non-Western individuals, Krab claims that a post-colonial trauma theory would be able to listen to previously unheard suffering. But the suffering that I'm interested in theorizing today, which is sexual assault, is unfortunately very well heard of. There are hundreds of films and novels about representation of sexual assault against Arab and Muslim women. Most of them are sensational, or at least kind of having a colonial understanding of women and their oppression. As a methodology, however, I prioritize analyzing representations of Arab women in transnational documentary films for 2 reasons. First, the documentary form has a closer claim to authenticity and truth, which makes it more dangerous. And secondly, transnational documentaries are more likely to circulate within international film festivals and eventually make their way to Western classrooms. And these films are usually given as quote-unquote progressive representations of Middle Eastern women, the films that are made by other women. Therefore, in my analysis, I focus on the Archive of Women Make Movies, which is a prestigious nonprofit feminist media art organization based in New York. Methodologically, I pursue in my close readings of a selection of documentaries a synthesis between transnational feminist film theory, post-colonial feminist theory, and Arab American feminisms. And in the creative component of my project, my work is guided by Alyssa Labau's theorization of first-person documentary. According to Labau, there are 2 main characteristics of first-person documentaries: subjectivity and relationality. For subjectivity, I think it's about time for Arab women to start speaking in the first person. And for relationality, I think that goes for all of us, that in order to understand the self, we have to understand it in relation to others. As part of the creative project, I also incorporate food studies, because for me, food is a source of nourishment, and the materiality of the food stands for the materiality of the body, which was wounded in the experience of trauma. By negotiating sexual trauma through food, I allow for the possibility of reinventing the self and possibly for healing. Let me share some of the findings that I have come up with so far in my reading of the Archive of Women Make Movies. There are 26 films listed under the subject of sexual assault in this database, and 17 of them address sexual assault against non-Western women. I focus on 4 of them that are specifically about sexual trauma against Middle Eastern women. There are some common characteristics between these movies. First, the representation of Arab women as ahistorical monolithic subjects. Second, sexual assault happens only to children and to working class women. Third, The definition of power is usually in binary terms between third world women, who are ultimate victims, and brown men, who are the ultimate oppressors. Fourth, the assumption that Arab patriarchy is exceptionalism, and the claim that sexual assault is more prevalent in Arab communities. Finally, the representation of Islam itself as an inherently oppressive religion. The poster that I'm sharing here is of a film called Breaking Silence by Nadia Ali, produced in 2016. The film is a personal and intimate portrayal of 3 women sharing their stories of sexual assaults. This is presumably about women who are unable to speak to the point that the mouth is not even existing. The movie, ironically and unintentionally, expresses the degree of support that these women have received from their allegedly abusive communities. While the film is trying so hard to show this exceptional horror stories of Arab women, it kind of unintentionally showed that there's actually kind of a space for healing and space for community within the Islamic community that allows for women to speak to each other and to negotiate within their own religion a way for healing and for solidarity. As a conclusion, I argue that in order to produce a feminist representation of rape, we need to move beyond the obsession with representing the trauma event itself, and instead focus on the presence of trauma in everyday events. In my first-person documentary, I use cooking as a tool to assert resistance to both sexual trauma memory and to reconcile my post-colonial trauma.